Cliffe Knechtle is one of the most recognizable and convincing Christian apologists on the face of the planet. There are hundreds and hundreds of videos of him talking to and debating people of other worldviews, and an additional 100,000 edits of him on TikTok and Instagram spreading the good news. It's safe to say Cliffe displays a masterclass in consistency, and also a mastery of the Bible and a mastery of debate. But despite his extensive education, Cliffe has mastered a variety of different techniques and mindsets that allow him to maneuver in and out of discussions. First and foremost, without losing, and just as importantly, without scaring people away from faith by falsely representing Christianity. Cliffe has mastered 15 different key points that make him extremely effective in his evangelization that you have to know if you want to go out there and win some souls for Jesus. The first 5 are the most important things Cliffe does. The following 10 after those are still very important, but the first 5 are definitely the most pivotal things in his arguing style that makes him so convincing and so successful. If you can implement these points into your conversations and discussions with others, you'll significantly increase the chances that you not only cause people to think differently about their situation, but also cause them to think from a perspective that they haven't thought from before. And you'll also decrease the chances that you get talked into a position where you have to concede. And in typical Cliffe fashion, we're going to count them off like this. Point number 1. He recognizes key arguments and knows how to approach them. When you debate atheists or speak to people who are non-believers, chances are you're going to hear the same arguments over and over again. Arguments like moral relativism, the am I going to hell argument, the my truth, your truth argument, the why are you preaching out here argument, why is the Bible trustworthy, the Trinity makes no sense, the Bible has so many contradictions, if God is so good, ... if someone is a good person but they don't believe, why are you right and every other worldview is wrong, and the historical reliability of the Bible. Cliffe has heard all of these arguments at least 10,000 times each, so it makes sense that he knows how to approach it methodically and in the same most effective way possible. For example, if somebody says, why do you believe a book that's 2,000 years old? Cliffe approaches it with the 4 literary tests to show that a document is historically reliable. He uses literary style, manuscript evidence, archaeological evidence, and internal consistency to measure if a text is actually meant to be interpreted as reality. For these common arguments, you have to learn how to argue and defeat them because they're incredibly common. Once the answers make sense to people, they'll be able to better understand where you're coming from. And once their biases are cleared away, you'll be able to encourage them to, for example, read the Gospels, or explore prayer, or do something else that brings them closer to the faith, without those presuppositions holding them back. Those arguments are extremely common, so recognize when they happen and learn how to defend them. Study up on Cliffe. Second point. He doesn't try to refute baseless accusations. This is huge in debate. Cliffe lets people defend their own argument. He asks for evidence when people make claims. For example, if somebody claims that Jesus was an alien and that aliens sent him down to earth and then fooled everyone into thinking he was resurrected, he asks, what's your evidence for that? Let people's arguments sound silly when they try to explain them if they really don't make any sense. Oftentimes, if you forget to do this, you end up trying to refute the most ridiculous arguments, which most of the time don't even have any reasonable evidence to back them up. You can single-handedly derail potentially constructive conversations by forgetting to make people back up their own claims. If you fall into this trap, you'll be constantly defending yourself instead of making the other person defend their own claims. This is a rabbit hole that ends up leading to the smallest, tiniest, most insignificant semantics of debate that don't even ride on the fact that your faith is true or not. For example, if somebody says, how can you defend the Bible if it has so many contradictions? Instead of saying, it doesn't have any contradictions, look at this. Say, where do you find the contradictions? And then chances are, or actually I guarantee, they're just going to cherry pick verses out of context if they can even name one. Most of the time, people just parrot, the Bible has contradictions. They don't actually know what they're talking about. I've made this mistake a lot of times, and it kills my discussion every time. So make sure you avoid it. Make people back up their claims. Third point, he follows ideas to their logical conclusion. For example, if someone's an atheist, they have to subscribe to materialism, the fact that everything's matter and energy, to moral relativism, to hopelessness, to evil wins. Because ultimately, that's what atheism leads to. Saying there is no truth is also a truth statement, so it's self-defeating. If someone says something that seems outrageous, follow it to its natural conclusion and memorize the path that you take for future discussions. Remember that truth is not subjective, and nothing matters if God is not real. Make sure someone tells you their philosophy and worldview, and make sure that you keep them consistent and follow that worldview to its broader implications. Fourth point. He agrees with people. Now, every single time somebody makes a point in conversation he agrees with, he makes sure that they know he agrees. But then he uses that point of agreement to flip it on its head and convince them of something that they don't necessarily believe at that point. Make sure you point out when you agree with somebody, because that can build a lot of rapport and let the person know that you're not just trying to convert them, you're trying to have a genuine conversation with them. Then if you both agree on a certain idea, you can use that idea to follow it to its logical conclusion. For example, if you both agree that the Bible has been used to justify horrendous acts, first you can agree that those acts were horrendous, and then you can agree that the Bible was misinterpreted, and then you can agree that because those acts were horrendous, there must be an objective moral good, and then from that point you can argue for the existence of a God. See what I did there? I not only kept them consistent, I also followed that idea we agreed on to its logical conclusion, like in the last point. But ultimately, this is all in the name of building a good relationship and a genuine intellectual bond with the person you're talking to let them know that you're not in total opposition to their worldview. There's just certain things that you might disagree on. And the fifth most important point, he never condemns non-believers, and this is a huge one. He talks about everybody's equality and freedom of choice rather than condemning people who don't believe. If somebody asks, am I going to hell? Well, you really have no way of knowing that. So never ever tell somebody that they're going to hell if they don't believe. Nobody is screwed because we all have free will. What Cliffe does to diffuse this tension is he admits that he's a sinner and that he deserves hell, but he accepted Jesus Christ's gift of salvation willingly after studying the Gospels. He also mentions that if you choose to live life apart from God, he'll honor that lifestyle and give you an afterlife without him too. So really, it's just fair. It's our responsibility to truly read the Gospels and be an impartial judge whether or not Jesus was the truth. If someone is genuinely afraid of going to hell because they don't find enough evidence, Cliffe then encourages them to read the Gospels and see why so many people believe. Because most of the people that resent Christianity because of the whole thing of hell, they haven't even read the Gospels for themselves. And think about it this way, if Christians are truly wrong, you have nothing to worry about. So saying Christianity is untrustworthy because of condemnation, you're using something you don't even believe in as an argument against something you don't believe in. Also, we really can never know who goes to hell. We really can't. We don't know how God judges people. We know that Jesus gave criteria to get into heaven, but we don't know how God is going to ultimately judge somebody. So we leave that up to him, and we don't try to do it ourselves. Do not pretend to know the incredibly complex answers about heaven and hell when it's God's job to judge. That's a huge no-no. You have truly no idea, and it's going to sound really dogmatic and paint you in a poor light. Don't pretend to know who goes to hell. Only acknowledge the fact that salvation is a gift for those who willingly accept it. Okay, these next 10 points are still important, but the last 5 are the ones that Cliffe's argumentation really hinges on. But now we'll focus on the things that can really round you out and make you an effective evangelizer. Point number 6, he watches what he says very carefully. First and foremost, Cliffe Knechtle does not let people put words in his mouth, and if you watched his videos, you're well aware of this. Cliffe always defends himself if somebody puts words in his mouth. Oftentimes, people will draw insane conclusions that misrepresent what you say in order to paint your argument and your worldview in a bad light, especially if they're trying to win the debate. So watch out for sentences that start with, "So what you're saying is ... like Kathy Newman and Jordan Peterson. And also, Jordan Peterson watches very carefully what he says, so Kathy Newman looked silly by saying that once he called her out on it, so keep that in mind. If someone also says, "You said earlier that ... make sure it's something that you actually said. Pay close attention to what you say. If the person you're speaking to is trying to beat you, they'll try to corner you with every word you say by twisting it or reframing it in a way that's dishonest. Be very careful. Point number 7, he uses real-world examples. Cliffe can downsize cosmic-sized ideas and concepts into relatable and understandable real-world examples. He applies people's logic to normal circumstances and reasonable analogies. For example, somebody was talking to him about whether or not truth is subjective and going at him for preaching that his religion was true and everyone else's was false. So instead, Cliffe said, "Okay, I can believe what I want. I think there's a pink elephant right here, and that pink elephant is God." Now, does that sound ridiculous, or is that true? And then when the person tries to defend the fact that, oh, he can believe that, it just sounds silly. And Cliffe accomplished that by using a real-world example. He makes people be consistent with their worldview, and then also uses a real-world example to paint that worldview in a light where it doesn't make sense. 2 points in one. I like that. Always make sure your analogies and examples are as relatable and understandable as possible, using things the person you're speaking to understands. For example, if there's an athlete, do something involving sports. If they're a history buff, talk about the historical reliability of the gospel and have a conversation about what they use to classify a historical document as accurate. If they're a musician, reference music somehow. I like the example of if somebody plays Beethoven bad, do you blame the composer or the player? And then you can use that to argue people misrepresenting the Bible, using it to justify actions that really aren't Christ-like at all. Always try to make sure your examples are as understandable and relatable as possible while still making sense. Point number 8. He isn't afraid to admit when he doesn't know something. Now, if somebody asks a super difficult question that isn't answered in our faith, he lets people know that he cannot be sure. He offers an educated guess, but he makes it clear that he really doesn't know. And I wouldn't even recommend making an educated guess because he is extremely educated. So even his educated guesses are way more educated than mine or yours. Just because someone asks a question you don't know the answer to doesn't mean that your faith is any less valid. Sometimes that four-word answer, I do not know, is extremely effective. Make sure you clarify to the other person that just because you don't know something doesn't mean your faith is invalid. Make the point that even experts in their field don't know everything there is to know, and that's okay. I don't know is a fine answer, especially if the Bible doesn't specifically state the solution to the problem the person is posing to you. Point 9. He doesn't ever put down other faiths. He never discredits other faiths. He never slanders other prophets or beliefs. He's extremely nice to Muslims, Buddhists, atheists, etc. He only ever pokes holes in other faiths if he is challenged directly on that front. He brings up the moral differences between Muhammad and Jesus, for example. He challenges the beliefs of Hindus and Buddhists only when he's asked to, and he is rarely ever approached by Hindus or Buddhists. He never steers towards discounting another faith unless he absolutely has to in order to further the discussion. Don't compare Christianity to other faiths, and don't knock other beliefs in relation to Christianity unless you absolutely have to. This makes you look very dogmatic, and it doesn't paint Christianity in a good light. Remember, we have to love our atheist, Muslim, Buddhist, Hinduist, LGBT brothers and sisters just as much as we love our own Christian brothers and sisters. We have to represent Christ properly. We don't have to approve of their lifestyle or agree with their beliefs, but that doesn't mean we can't love them the same. They are still people made in the image of God. Point number 10. He never gets frustrated at irritating questions. Now, this is a big one, because sometimes I wonder how Cliff can be so patient, because I'm sitting behind my computer screen watching, I'm like, oh my gosh, what kind of a question is that? But Cliff keeps his cool a majority of the time. He is extremely patient with questions that are insanely specific. He doesn't flip out at questions that are flippant or meant to be a dig. Rather, he approaches them with intellectual honesty. He's also not impatient when he has to repeat an answer. Not every question is intended to annoy and antagonize you as much as it might seem so. Stay calm, cool, and collected, and recognize that everybody is in a different place aside from you. But that leads me nicely to point number 11, which is he ends conversations politely when they're getting nowhere. Sometimes people just refuse to listen to your answers. Sometimes people don't want to believe, and they look to be right instead of look to be open-minded. Repeat an answer a few times, and once you keep harping it and they won't listen, then you politely end the conversation. Shake their hand and say, sorry, we're not getting anywhere. You don't have to convert everybody you speak to about your faith. A lot of times, the best thing you could do is just plant seeds and let them do the work. Let them do the research. And a lot of the time, people just talk to you and try to debate you or try to have a conversation about God with you just so that they can prove themselves right. And sometimes their ego won't let them be wrong about anything, and they'll just refuse to listen to you. Oftentimes, people refuse to believe the supernatural exists. Other times, people just come in with the notion that there's no way God can exist, so I must be right, and this Christian must be wrong. Therefore, even if your Christian argument completely demolishes theirs, they may not even accept the fact that they've lost the argument or lost that particular point in the argument and just refuse to listen to you. If that's the case, politely end the conversation and move on to the next. Point number 12, he's extremely friendly and polite. He is a very good reflection of a Christ follower. Although he gets aggravated from time to time, he's very consistently nice unless somebody is being rude to him repeatedly. He gives people compliments. He goes along with jokes. He concludes discussions respectfully, as we just talked about. He connects with people personally and lets them know that they're his friend above everything else, not just somebody he wants to convert. After all, everyone is a human being made in the image of God, so you have to respect everybody. He also lets people know that he's not brainwashed into the faith by providing evidence why he believes. That is a lot more safe for people to talk to him because it's not just a conversion therapy space. It's more of a discussion space where everyone gets to bring their own opinions and findings to the table. He conveys his humanity by saying he's not brainwashed, and rather he believes Jesus was a real person and it's rational to believe in God, and that Jesus was reliable and provably so. This is huge for people because people just assume Christians grew up in a Christian household or they were brainwashed into it, and they really don't see that there is a lot of evidence for it, and that's why apologists are so effective, and that's why they're so important. It's important to know why your faith is true. Make it clear in your conversations that you're not brainwashed, but that you genuinely believe Jesus was reliable, and also make sure that you have the evidence to back it up. And make sure you're polite, friendly, and genuine. Point number 13, he doesn't preach, he reasons. Cliffe avoids quoting the Bible unless he's asked. And believe me, Cliffe can quote the Bible. He can quote it really, really well. But the point is, do not preach faith to somebody who doesn't believe it, because it's not gonna work. This is an easy way to make it seem like your goal is to simply convert them based on blind faith alone. From an outside perspective, it doesn't look honest. Make sure you approach your discussions with evidence, honesty, and friendliness, and avoid preaching unless asked. Point number 14, he isn't afraid to call out people when they're being dishonest. Always make sure you call out people on dishonest behavior, especially if somebody's being intellectually dishonest. When people claim one thing, like moral relativism or materialism, and then talk about some kind of objective morality or even use the words good and bad, call them on it, because their ideology doesn't allow that. Make sure you keep track of what the person you're talking to believes, because they have to stay consistent with their views. Remember, if you keep them consistent, but it actually doesn't line up with what they believe, you can use that to break down their views, and then you can use that to encourage them to maybe see your views instead. Make sure people stay consistent with their views. Don't let them cherry pick facets for their argument that contradict their beliefs. Further, don't let people cherry pick Bible verses out of context. Stay on your toes and recognize and call out intellectually dishonest behavior, because that'll further your discussions a lot more. And it'll give you an opening to tell them about Christ. Point number 15, he never tries to convert people. Discussions will never fully convert people. That is just a fantasy us Christians have. It is never going to happen unless you are extremely lucky. Ultimately, people need to find enough evidence for it to be believable, especially if they're skeptical, they're a non-believer, or they're just opposed to it in general, or they're just of another religion. Don't push for conversion in a conversation with a non-believer. Instead, push for intellectual honesty and an exchange of ideas. Your goal is to present the fact that Jesus is reliable and that other worldviews are unreliable. And in order to do that, you need evidence, you need consistency, you need intellectual honesty, and you need to be able to do everything I just mentioned. So don't try to convert. Try to encourage. And your bonus point, number 16. Make sure that you actually believe what you're saying. If you're not a genuine believer yet, if you're exploring but you're not quite there yet, if you are having doubts, your faith is shaky, you're not really 100% all in, you haven't given your life to Christ, don't engage in evangelistic conversation, because it's not going to end well for you, most likely. In fact, I would wager that you might even be swayed the opposite direction if somebody presents a good enough argument. Make sure you're rock solid in your faith and that you have your talking points and that you've given your life to Christ before you try to bring other people in. Think about it this way. If you're hanging off a lifeboat and you extend your arm to somebody else to pull them in, you're just pulling them next to the lifeboat. You're not actually saving them from anything. So make sure that you're 100% in and you can offer people the true way. Also, make sure that you're living out your faith. When people can see that, they can see that you're the real deal and that you know what you're talking about and you live what you're talking about and you're genuine and you're honest. Cliffe Knechtle is such a valuable resource and excellent mind that we have on our side. And if you're a Christian who's just beginning or devout for some time, he's an incredible resource to strengthen your faith. Once again, apologetics are an extremely important part of Christianity, because the more knowledge we have, the more we can defend the faith. The more of Cliffe's points we utilize, the better we'll be at having conversations with non-believers. We're called to apologetics in 1 Peter chapter 3 verse 15. It's a biblical command to be armed with information to to defend the faith. So if you don't know where to start in combating arguments that go against our faith in Christ, listen to Cliffe and apply these strategies. Your faith will grow so much stronger, not just because you have faith and personal experience with God, but also because you have logical and practical reasons why you believe. You have true evidence to support the existence of the Christian God. Because unfortunately, sometimes when you have doubts, spiritual evidence and personal experience aren't enough. And when you're talking to a non-believer, anecdotal evidence isn't going to get you very far. Now, anecdotal evidence is great supporting evidence for practical and logical and historical evidence, but it's not good evidence on its own. Sometimes it's okay to reason yourself back to belief if you're having doubts because you know the evidence, you know how to defend the faith, and you know the practical reasons why it's true. I'll link Cliffe's channel in the description, but I'm sure you already follow it, subscribe to it, or whatever. So yeah, do with that what you must. Thank you for watching, and God bless you.